Greetings, fellow mechaniacs and non-orc hobbyists, and welcome back to another episode of Sork's Mech Shop. Today's episode comes at the request of one of my friends and subscribers, Jared, who asked me to talk about the actual technical differences between painting techniques known as layering, washing, and glazing. There are other techniques that I'll cover in other videos, but these are the three really key ones for any hobbyist to have in their tool bag, and so we're going to cover them here today. At the most basic level, the main differences between these techniques is the opacity the paint's applied and the purpose to which you use them. So let's have a look at each of them in turn. We're going to demo this first using GIMP. I've done a little line art Space Marine that I found on the internet. It was uncredited. I'm not sure who did it. The author was deleted, but I've just sort of filled in a shoulder pad with sort of a medium red. And then I'm going here for a slightly darker red that I'm going to paint into the corner here. And essentially you're taking just an opaque layer of paint and you're applying it over your previous layer. So in this case, I'm taking a darker layer, putting it on, then I'm doing another darker layer and putting it on to create sort of the illusion of shadow. And then after that, I'm going to go back in and I'm going to get a lighter layer of, again, opaque paint, and I'll put it on top here to get the highlights. Now, when you're doing an actual miniature, you're still going to use thin layers of paint because you don't want to create like kind of a cakey buildup, but they will be thin layers of opaque paint. And that's what the layering technique is going to call for. So going back to our spirits here to see layering in action, I'm using a really light yellow to get started over our bone-colored kind of semi-prime that we did with the airbrush the other day. Just sort of sketching in over it with the first coat of yellow. We'll darken this down later on by mixing in a little bit of the yellow oxide ink. Just get a nice thin but opaque layer everywhere on the helmet. And then we'll also go over the wristbands as well. I decided that we want a little more yellow on it than just the helmet for this guy. Make him stand out a little bit more against his Wraithblade companions. Once again, I try to go for the largest brush that I can use that gets where I want, as long as I have a nice clean point to it. Just sort of go everywhere and use the tip as much as possible, keep the belly of the brush loaded. Just sort of sketch it in there. I don't worry too much about slop at this point because I'm going to come in and block in with other colors later. So I try to be neat, but I don't worry too much if it overflows just a little bit, especially in areas that I haven't painted yet that's still that zenithal prime that we did last video. I'm using the airbrush here completely empty. It's literally just using air. I'm using it to essentially like a hairdryer. It's blowing off just pure air to help dry the paint a little bit faster and allow me to move on to the next step without worrying about reactivating the paint that I just laid down. Little trick of the trade there for you. Free one. Didn't cover it at the beginning of the video. Here I'm mixing it in on the wet palette, as I said, that yellow oxide ink. Give me a darker yellow. This one I'm going to actually apply to almost everywhere except for the very edges, because I decided that initial Space Dust yellow wasn't quite dark enough for the main base coat, so I'm essentially creating a new base coat with a mix. As I've said before, I don't really plan out my paint jobs ahead of time too much. I kind of experiment as I go, and so I'll try one thing. If I don't like it, I'll adjust as I go. I find it to be sort of a freeing technique that way. I don't over analyze or over dither ahead of time, especially if I'm just doing one model or if I'm doing the first model of a squad. If I'm doing the first model, I'll do it this way, and then after that I'll start working up the efficiency, you know, trying to make it more efficient and fewer steps and things like that. In the case of this guy, though, being the first one, or the only spirits here I'm working on, then I can afford to be a little bit less efficient. And then back to the airbrush again once, as I said before, to dry off the paint a little bit quicker so I can go on to the next step. And what I'll be doing next, this is again sort of a rebase layering with a darker paint, and then I'm going back in with the Space Dust yellow from Army Painter to hit the highlights and go to getting the next layer in there. And now what you do in this layer is I'm not actually getting everywhere that darker color is. I'm getting probably 2/3 or 3/4 of the surfaces and only the upward facing ones. Since it's a lighter color, I'm trying to imagine where light would hit in a normal kind of lighted environment of the battlefield, and trying to hit those spots, and especially where there's areas that are definitely in shadow or they're around objects on the helmet, like he's got little beads everywhere. Those little beads, I keep those from getting hit with this. And just kind of go all the way around, same thing on the wrists, make sure to get those. And then after this, I'm gonna add in a little bit of titanium white, squirt some on the wet palette, mix it in with the Space Dust, and that'll represent the highest of highlights to get the real edges of the helmet, the sharpest parts of the helmet. And some folks call this edge highlighting, but it really is just another kind of layering. It's just layering right on the very edges of the sharp corners of your miniatures to really provide kind of an extra glint of spots that would catch, that kind of light and reflect it tightly. Washes and glazes are very similar, and so we're going to cover them at the same time on our little Space Marine buddy here. In both cases, you're dealing with mostly transparent, very thin paint. The difference is in application. So with a wash, what you're going to do is take a darker paint, usually, that is very, very thin. So think something about like a milk kind of consistency, or like a skim milk, and you're going to apply it pretty much in the recesses of your model. Some people even just hit it on everything in the model and let it sink into the recesses. That's an option too, although if you do that, it will dull down your highlights a little bit. And so I showed you that here, as you can see, kind of going in the corner. A glaze, by comparison, is also semi-transparent, but you generally will wick it off your paintbrush a little bit, and you'll apply it over everything. And by doing that, it's creating a very thin kind of filter over other layers of paint. So what the intent there is to kind of recolor a little bit. In this case, it's not the best way to see, but I have a yellow layer, actually, completely yellow layer that is largely transparent, and it's actually causing our more harsher layers, that shows up a little better there. It's causing our more harsh layers to blend together more seamlessly by providing kind of that transparent filter over them. So that's kind of the point of a glaze, is it allows you to either tint colors below it, so like turning a red slightly warmer, or to help to kind of blend together harsher lines, harsher layers between below it, and make them more seamless. We'll show you how to do that on the model here in a second. Washing this miniature, we're going to use burnt umber artist ink and Army Painter airbrush medium. You can use any kind of acrylic paint you want, and even water if you like to. I just find that artist ink has a really nice pigment density, and that helps make a wash nice and dark in the recesses. And then the airbrush medium does a really good job of allowing the ink to flow into the crevices just like you want to. If you use water, then a lot of times, if you're not careful, you can wind up having coffee staining when the surface tension of the water causes your pigments to stick to the raised areas of the model. You can overcome that by adding some kind of a surfactant, such as dish soap or that sort of thing. But then if you use dish soap and you use too much, then you create bubbles, and so you have similar problems. So for my money, it's easier just to get some of that airbrush medium, which I then end up using in my airbrush anyway, and mixing it for my washes, and it's kind of a 2-for-1 deal. Once I've mixed it up, as you saw, I tested it on back of my thumbnail just to sort of see the transparency and see how it was flowing. I went ahead and started applying it fairly liberally across the model. As I mentioned in the previous clip when I was doing it in GIMP, you can either be very targeted with a wash or you can be very liberal with a wash. I tend to be fairly liberal with them unless I have a specific reason not to be. And in this case, what I'm going to end up doing after this, not in this clip, but in terms of just the model workflow, is I'll be pretty liberal here, and then I'll end up coming back and layering a bone color back on over the wash again. This is, if you remember the last video when we were, or not the last one, but if you remember the Wraithblade video, the pin wash we did is very similar to this. Pin wash we did with the burnt umber oils is very similar. The difference being that instead of having to go back and repaint like I'm going to have to do here, I was able to just use some makeup sponges and a little bit of the mineral spirits to clean up after myself. So your mileage may vary, choose which one you prefer to do. I think that both are perfectly valid, and it's just a question of which approach you prefer as far as which one you think's better. Both of them work perfectly well. And just going all the way around all the bone parts to get them all with this technique, and then we'll let it dry and we'll move on to glazing once we get it all done. For the glazing, I decided to do something a little different for his face mask. Using a turquoise ink and the same airbrush medium as before, I went ahead and used a Duralumin Vallejo metal color to paint his face mask to start with. Once that was thoroughly dried, I mixed up this glaze using the ink and medium as before. The only difference in this case is I actually added a little bit more of the medium than I did for the wash, which might have been a mistake, but I was trying to make it a little bit thinner to make it more transparent than I did with the wash. What the result here was, as you can see, it's kind of beating up a little bit more on my thumb than the other one did, and so it does mean that I will ultimately have to do several layers as it dries, and I'm not going to show that on this video. So you'll see me do one layer, and then the final product, whenever I get around to it, will have had several layers of this. But as mentioned before, I load the brush, then I wick it off, and then I just start drawing the brush across the miniature as before. In this case, just sort of being very careful not to flood too much of the glaze on there, and each pass is going to leave just a very thin layer of transparent paint on there, and it's just going to change the color of the underlying metal, in this case, very subtly, and just tint it ever so slightly. And the more you layer on over it, the more the tint is going to occur. So it's a really cool way, especially with metals, to provide that kind of colored metallic effect, where you're still sure that it's metallic, but it's also got some kind of a color to it. You can also do this with contrast paints if you want to, but I find that the inks work just as well, and that's what I used to use before contrasts were invented. So we're doing it again here. It also lends kind of an alien look to things a lot of times, to have that metal with the ink sort of providing that color to it. So another reason to go for it in this particular case. And once again, just being very careful not to puddle or pool it too much, except for on the edges. And if you do it on the edges, then it works a little bit like a wash again. There's not much difference between a glaze and a wash, except for how you're applying it. So in this case, I'm kind of doing both in one step, but trying to make sure that on the main surface of it that I'm still doing the glazing, where again I've got a very little bit on the brush and I'm just sort of drawing it across in repeated strokes and trying to build up those layers. very thin, transparent layers, which differentiates the glaze from a regular layer technique. Well, that's it for today's episode, hobbyists. Thanks once again for stopping by, and I hope this was helpful. If you're wondering where things like contrast or speed paints fall into this mix, the answer is they're kind of a combination. The formulation of their medium is such that they're essentially something like a thick ink, which makes them effectively a cross between a glaze and a wash. To be honest, I use them quite often, but rarely as advertised. I use them as just one step in my process rather than as a replacement for an entire color sequence. Please let me know in the comments section if you want to see more of these shorter, more technique-focused videos, or if you prefer the long-term, full model videos that I did in the beginning of the channel. I'm happy to do either kind of content, but I need to know which you prefer as an audience. Until next time, keep on looting.